Night pressed down on the battlefield like a physical weight. Not the quiet kind of night, but the restless kind, where engines coughed in the dark, wounded men groaned somewhere beyond sight, and the wind carried the metallic smell of cordite and fear. The front line had not moved in days. Maps still showed arrows pointing forward, but the men knew better. Forward had become an idea, not a direction. Morale does not collapse loudly. It cracks. It begins in small places, a soldier hesitating before standing up, a rifle cleaned too slowly, a joke that no longer lands. Fear doesn't arrive screaming, it settles in, patient and corrosive. By the time commanders notice it, it is already deep in the bones of an army. This was the moment commanders dreaded more than enemy artillery. An army can lose men and still fight. It can lose ground and still recover. But when belief dies, when soldiers stop believing tomorrow will be different, the war is already slipping away. World War II was not only fought with steel and fire. It was fought inside exhausted minds, inside frozen trenches, inside the long seconds before a whistle blew. And by late 1943 in more than one sector, that inner war was being lost. Men were tired. Not the cinematic kind of tired, the quiet, hollow fatigue that comes from weeks of danger without release. Some had seen too much. Others had seen nothing but waiting. Both were deadly. Waiting made fear grow roots. Commanders could feel it spreading. Reports spoke of combat exhaustion, battle fatigue, loss of fighting spirit. Polite words for a terrifying truth. The line was close to breaking. If it broke, no amount of tanks would save it. This was the moment when one voice was summoned, not gentle, not reassuring, not kind. A voice that did not soothe fear. A voice that confronted it. Into this fragile psychological battlefield stepped George Patton, a man who believed that fear, properly aimed, could be more powerful than comfort. A man who understood something unsettling about war. Soldiers do not only fight to live. Sometimes they fight because they are more afraid of failing than of dying. Patton did not whisper hope. He shouted consequences. Before a single word of his speech was spoken, the men could feel it coming. His reputation moved faster than he did, stories of discipline, of fury, of unyielding expectations. To some, he was salvation. To others, terror in polished boots. And when he finally stood before them, the battlefield fell quiet, not because the war had paused, but because something else had taken its place. Attention. In that silence, morale hung in the balance. What Patton was about to do would either rebuild purpose, or shatter what little remained. Because words, when spoken at the edge of collapse, do not merely motivate. They decide who keeps moving forward, and who cannot. By the time morale began to crack, the world these soldiers inhabited had already stripped away every illusion they once carried into war. This was not the war of posters or speeches back home. It was a world of mud that swallowed boots whole, of cold that seeped through wool and bone, of days measured not by sunlight but by shelling schedules. The terrain itself felt hostile, hedgerows that hid death, hills that demanded blood for every meter gained, roads littered with burned-out vehicles that whispered warnings to anyone passing by. Sleep came in fragments. Hunger was constant. Fear was background noise. Men lived surrounded by reminders of mortality, helmets abandoned where their owners no longer needed them, letters never finished, foxholes that doubled as graves. The battlefield was not simply a place, it was an atmosphere heavy and inescapable. What broke morale was not always the enemy. It was repetition. Advance. Stop. Dig in. Wait. Artillery. Silence. More waiting. Another order. Another push. Another loss. Over time, danger stopped shocking the mind and began exhausting it. Soldiers learned the sound of incoming fire too well. They learned how long they could crouch before their legs trembled. They learned which men in their unit were already halfway gone, eyes distant, movements mechanical. Commanders tracked ammunition and fuel. But morale could not be counted so neatly. It lived in posture, in voices, in the speed at which men responded to orders. When morale weakened, soldiers still followed commands, but without urgency. Attacks became slower. Risks were avoided. Initiative vanished. The army still existed, but its spirit had thinned. This was the most dangerous phase of any campaign, because an enemy could sense it. Across Europe, opposing forces understood the same brutal truth. A tired army is not defeated by force alone. It is defeated by doubt, by hesitation, by the quiet decision, made in 1,000 individual minds, that survival matters more than momentum. War planners had names for this: attrition, operational fatigue, psychological strain, but on the ground it felt simpler and more frightening. Men were losing the reason to keep pushing. In this environment, leadership became something different. Not strategy on a map but emotional control in real time. The ability to inject belief where exhaustion had drained it away. Some leaders tried empathy. Others tried rest. Others rotated units and hoped time would heal what war had damaged. But time was the one resource they did not have. The war demanded movement, pressure, relentless advance. And when comfort failed to restore morale, another approach emerged, one far more dangerous but immediate. Fear. Not the raw fear of enemy fire, but a directed fear. Fear of disgrace, fear of letting comrades down, fear of being remembered as the one who broke when others endured. This was the psychological landscape Patton entered. He did not see tired men who needed reassurance. He saw an army on the verge of forgetting why it existed. To him, morale was not a fragile thing to be protected. It was a weapon to be sharpened. And the battlefield, mud, blood, exhaustion, silence, was the forge. As soldiers gathered, boots sinking into the ground they had already fought over too many times, they were about to hear a version of war that offered no comfort at all. Only a choice. Move forward or collapse. History rarely remembers the exact moment an army loses its will. There is no single explosion. No formal announcement. No line on a map labeled "Here is where belief ended." Instead, collapse begins invisibly, inside the nervous systems of men who have carried fear for too long. Military theorists have long understood this, even if they struggled to name it. Armies do not disintegrate when they run out of weapons. They disintegrate when cohesion dissolves, when individuals stop trusting that the person beside them will stand fast when the moment comes. This is why morale has always been more valuable than numbers. An army with confidence can survive disaster. An army without it can crumble despite superiority. Throughout history, commanders watched units break not under overwhelming fire, but under uncertainty. Soldiers began to ask the forbidden questions. Why us? Why now? What's the point? Once those questions appeared, discipline alone could not suppress them. World War II magnified this problem. The scale was unprecedented. Campaigns lasted months instead of days. Front lines stretched endlessly. Victories felt temporary, defeats permanent. The psychological strain accumulated without release, grinding men down long after their bodies had adapted. Medical officers reported rising cases of combat exhaustion. Men froze in place. Others wandered aimlessly. Some could no longer hold a rifle steady. These were not cowards. They were men whose internal defenses had been worn thin by constant threat. Commanders faced a terrifying dilemma. If they acknowledged fear too openly, it spread. If they ignored it, it festered. Traditional motivation, honor, duty, patriotism, worked well at the beginning of wars. But under sustained pressure, those abstractions lost their power. Survival became immediate, personal. This was the point where armies historically either adapted or collapsed. In ancient battles, routes happened when soldiers believed retreat was safer than staying. In modern war, retreat was not always possible. There were no clear escape routes, only deeper danger. Fear had nowhere to go. And when fear has nowhere to go, it turns inward. This is what Patton understood with unsettling clarity. To him, fear was inevitable. Trying to remove it was foolish. The question was not whether soldiers felt fear, but what they feared most. If they feared death alone, they would seek safety at any cost. But if they feared failure in the eyes of comrades, commanders, history, then fear could be redirected. Weaponized. Given purpose. This idea was not humane. It was not gentle. But in Patton's mind, it was necessary. He believed that hesitation killed more soldiers than aggression. That a stalled army invited destruction. That collapse began the moment men believed breaking was acceptable. So his solution was not to promise safety. It was to make collapse unbearable. By framing retreat as disgrace, hesitation as betrayal, and endurance as the only honorable option, Patton aimed to close the psychological exit doors that fear normally offers. There would be no mental refuge. Only forward. To critics, this bordered on cruelty. To Patton, it was realism. Because in war, he believed the moment an army allows itself to stop believing, it does not rest. It dies. As morale trembled and commanders searched for answers, Patton prepared to speak, not as a comforter but as a force multiplier. What he would say next was designed to harden minds already cracking. And once spoken, it could not be taken back. Long before morale began to fracture on European soil, George Patton had already decided what kind of war he was meant to fight. He did not see himself as a caretaker of men's emotions. He saw himself as a conductor of violence, someone whose duty was to unleash force faster and harder than the enemy could endure. Everything about him reflected this belief. The polished helmet, the rigid posture, the deliberate theatrics. None of it was accidental. Patton believed war was, at its core, psychological domination. Not just over the enemy, but over one's own fear. He studied history obsessively. Ancient generals, medieval battles, the rise and collapse of empires. From them he drew a single, unshakable lesson: hesitation was fatal. Armies that paused lost initiative. Armies that doubted invited destruction. Where others saw complexity, Patton saw clarity. Move fast. Hit hard. Never let fear settle. To many senior officers he was brilliant and unbearable in equal measure. His confidence bordered on arrogance. His discipline was absolute. His intolerance for weakness was legendary. Yet again and again, when situations grew desperate, it was Patton who was sent in. Because desperation was where he thrived. He believed men performed best when pushed to the edge, when comfort was removed and expectations were made brutally clear. In his mind, war did not allow room for emotional ambiguity. Soldiers needed certainty, even if that certainty was terrifying. Patton understood spectacle. He knew that soldiers listen with their eyes as much as their ears. His appearance, his language, his presence, all were part of a carefully constructed identity. When he spoke, it was never casually. Every word was meant to land like a blow. He did not promise survival. He promised meaning. To Patton, meaning was found in aggression, in movement, in refusing to yield. He believed men would endure almost anything if they believed stopping was worse. This philosophy shaped how he addressed morale. Where other commanders softened their tone as men weakened, Patton hardened his. He believed kindness at the wrong moment bred doubt. That reassurance could be mistaken for permission to falter. So when morale cracked, he did not lower the standard. He raised it. This made him deeply divisive. Some soldiers found his certainty anchoring. In a world of chaos, his absolute convictions felt stabilizing. Others felt crushed beneath them, their fear amplified rather than soothed. But Patton was not interested in consensus. He was interested in results. As units gathered to hear him speak, they did not expect comfort. They expected intensity. They expected to be challenged, provoked, and judged. And Patton intended exactly that. Because in his view, the worst thing a commander could do to a frightened army was acknowledge the possibility of collapse. Instead, he would redefine collapse itself as something more terrifying than death. And when he finally opened his mouth, the speeches that followed would not ask soldiers how they felt. They would tell them who they were expected to be. The reports arrived quietly, buried beneath operational updates and supply requests. Units advancing slower than expected. Platoons hesitating under fire. Officers noting a decline in aggressiveness. On paper, nothing looked catastrophic. No routes. No mass surrenders. But commanders who had been in war long enough recognized the pattern. This was how collapse announced itself, politely, incrementally, almost apologetically. The enemy was not overwhelming these forces. Time was. Men had pushed forward through months of uncertainty, through victories that felt temporary and losses that felt permanent. Each mile gained demanded more than the last. Each engagement took something invisible and irreplaceable. Confidence. In some units, soldiers advanced because they were ordered to, not because they believed the advance mattered. They followed procedure, not purpose. And in war, that difference is lethal. Small delays multiplied. Attacks lost momentum. Opportunities closed before they could be seized. The battlefield punished hesitation ruthlessly. Commanders sensed something slipping away. The front lines were still intact, but psychologically, fractures were spreading. Soldiers talked less about winning and more about surviving. The language had changed. Survival is necessary, but when it becomes the primary objective, strategy begins to unravel. This was the context in which Patton was called forward. Not to replace broken units. Not to introduce new tactics. But to repair something far more fragile. Belief. He arrived at formations where faces were hollowed by exhaustion, where eyes scanned the distance not for enemies but for threats unseen. These were men who had already endured more than they believed possible, and were being asked to endure more. Patton did not ask them how they were holding up. He studied them. He watched how they stood, how they responded, how quickly they snapped to attention. He saw the signs others missed, the micro-hesitations, the stiffness born of fear, the silence where confidence once lived. To Patton, this silence was intolerable. Because silence meant doubt. And doubt, once allowed to settle, became permission. He believed that if an army accepted fear as an excuse, it would soon accept retreat as an option. And once retreat entered the collective imagination, the war was already turning. So he prepared to speak, not as a fellow sufferer but as a judge. The speeches he delivered in these moments were not polished for history. They were raw, confrontational, designed for immediate effect. They were meant to shock men out of paralysis, to force a decision inside each listener. Stay afraid and freeze. Or redirect that fear into action. Patton understood that morale could not be rebuilt with half measures. He would not soothe. He would not sympathize. He would draw a line so stark that stepping back felt impossible. The men listening did not know this yet. They only knew that something was coming, that the pause they had grown accustomed to was ending. And when Patton spoke, the battlefield would change, not because the enemy had moved but because fear itself was being reshaped. When George Patton finally spoke, it was never softly. His voice did not rise to comfort, it struck to command attention. The words came fast, deliberate, unapologetic. There was no easing into the message, no acknowledgement of exhaustion, no ritual sympathy for what the men had endured. Patton did not believe fear should be hidden. He believed it should be cornered. He spoke of war not as tragedy but as a test, one that judged men harshly and without appeal. He reminded soldiers that history did not remember those who hesitated. That nations survived because someone had the will to push forward when stopping felt safer. Retreat, in his telling, was not a tactical option. It was disgrace. Patton's speeches followed a brutal internal logic. First, he stripped away excuses. Fatigue, fear, uncertainty, these were realities, not justifications. Then he reframed the battlefield itself. Every step forward became proof of worth. Every pause became a silent confession of weakness. He spoke of shame with surgical precision. Not abstract shame but personal. The kind that lingered after survival. The idea of going home knowing others had advanced while you did not. The thought of explaining hesitation to men who never hesitated again because they died moving forward. This was not accidental cruelty. It was calculated pressure. Patton understood that fear multiplies when left undefined. So he gave it a shape. He redirected it away from the enemy and toward something closer. Identity, legacy, self-respect. The message was clear. You will be afraid either way. Choose what you are afraid of. Some men felt anger ignite where despair had been. Others felt their spines stiffen, pride overriding fatigue. A few felt something darker, a tightening in the chest, the realization that there was no acceptable exit. This was the risk of Patton's approach. Words like these did not gently lift morale. They compressed it, like coal under pressure, hoping it would harden into resolve instead of shattering. And for many units it worked. Attacks regained urgency. Movements sharpened. Soldiers advanced not because fear was gone, but because it had been repurposed. Fear became fuel instead of friction. But beneath the renewed momentum, something else took root. A silent cost. Because when fear is used as a weapon, it does not disappear after the battle. It stays, waiting, echoing, reshaping how men remember what they survived. Patton's speeches had done their job. The line moved again. But the question no one dared to ask yet was whether something essential had been lost in the process, something that could not be reclaimed once words had done their work. The battlefield moved again, but the men did not feel victorious. They advanced because stopping no longer felt like an option. Every step forward carried the weight of Patton's words, echoing louder than the artillery. Courage, in this moment, was not the absence of fear, it was movement under threat. Not just the threat of the enemy, the threat of being judged. Inside each soldier, a quiet calculation unfolded. Fear of death competed with fear of disgrace. Fear of pain wrestled with fear of being remembered as the one who broke. For some, that tension sharpened focus. For others, it hollowed them out. This was the unseen battlefield Patton had created. Men charged positions they might have hesitated to approach days earlier. Orders were executed faster, more aggressively. There was less discussion, less questioning. Momentum returned, and with it, a sense of inevitability. But inevitability is a double-edged thing. In foxholes and makeshift camps, when the noise subsided, soldiers replayed the speeches in their minds. Some felt empowered, convinced they had discovered reserves of strength they never knew existed. Others felt trapped, as if their humanity had been reduced to a single demand: endure. The internal struggle intensified. To show fear was weakness. To hesitate was failure. To break was unforgivable. This environment forged resilience in some and fracture in others. The same pressure that produced heroism also produced silence. Men swallowing doubt, hiding panic, refusing to admit they were reaching their limits. Patton believed this was necessary. He trusted that war demanded suppression of vulnerability, that soldiers who confronted fear openly risked spreading it. In his worldview, strength had to be absolute, or at least appear that way. Yet the cost was cumulative. Men carried fear alone. They pushed forward with clenched jaws and rigid posture, convincing themselves that everyone else was coping better than they were. Isolation grew, even among comrades fighting side by side. The battlefield rewarded aggression. The mind absorbed the damage. And still the advance continued. From the outside it looked like success. Lines moved. Objectives fell. Commanders praised renewed fighting spirit. Patton's methods seemed vindicated by results written in captured ground and enemy losses. But beneath the surface something fragile was forming, a delayed reckoning. Fear had been mastered but not resolved. Suppressed but not healed. And suppressed fear has a way of returning later in quieter, more devastating forms. For now, though, the war demanded only one thing: forward motion. And as long as the men kept moving, the question of what it was costing them could wait. There came a moment, usually after the speeches ended, after the boots had moved and the guns had spoken, when silence returned. Not the silence of fear but the silence of thought. In that space a question surfaced in the minds of some men. Not spoken aloud. Not shared. Barely even acknowledged. Is this what strength looks like? Patton's words had done what they were designed to do. The line held. The advance continued. From a strategic view, the problem of morale had been solved. But strategy does not live inside a man's chest. Consequences do. Around campfires and in dugouts, soldiers watched one another closely. Who laughed? Who didn't? Who slept easily? Who stared too long into nothing? The bravest men were not always the loudest. Sometimes they were the quiet ones who simply kept going. This was the moment where traditional documentaries often stop asking questions. Success had been achieved. Ground taken. Orders obeyed. But war does not end when objectives are met. It lingers, inside memory, inside muscle, inside the nervous system. And the way morale is rebuilt matters just as much as the fact that it is. Patton believed fear could be mastered by denying it oxygen. By making the alternative, collapse, shame, retreat, more terrifying than death itself. And in the short term it worked. But what happens to an army when fear is never allowed to surface? When there is no language for weakness? When endurance becomes the only acceptable identity? Some men thrived in this clarity. They needed an absolute standard. They needed certainty even if it was brutal. For them, Patton's speeches were stabilizing, an anchor in chaos. Others paid a quieter price. They learned to hide distress, to internalize panic, to measure their worth solely by how much pain they could suppress. They survived the war but not unchanged. This was not visible on after-action reports. It surfaced later, in nightmares, in sudden silences, in anger without a clear cause. The delayed echo of fear, never released, never processed. The audience is left here deliberately. Not with answers, but with discomfort. Because leadership under pressure always demands trade-offs. There is no pure method. No clean solution. Only choices made under extreme constraint, and their consequences. Patton chose fear as a tool. The army moved. History recorded victories. But the deeper question remained unresolved, waiting for distance and time to give it shape. Did fear rebuild morale, or merely postpone collapse? From a distance, an army looks uniform. Helmets aligned. Rifles identical. Movements synchronized. It is easy, almost necessary, to forget that morale is not held by formations, but by individuals. Men with names, histories, fears, and thresholds that are never the same. Patton spoke to masses. His words landed on individuals. Some stood taller as he spoke. They felt seen, not as victims of circumstance, but as participants in something vast and consequential. For these men, his certainty was a relief. The rules were clear. Expectations absolute. Doubt had no place to hide. Others listened with a tightening chest. They heard not challenge but ultimatum. Not purpose but pressure. They nodded, shouted when expected, moved when ordered, while privately calculating how much more they could absorb. Letters written later revealed the split. Some soldiers described Patton's speeches as electrifying, the moment they remembered why they were there. Others wrote cautiously, circling around words they could not safely commit to paper. Fear, resentment, exhaustion that felt forbidden. One man remembered gripping his rifle so tightly his hands went numb, not from cold, but from the realization that fear itself had become dangerous to admit. Another recalled feeling invincible for days afterward, convinced nothing could break him. Both experiences were true. This was the paradox of Patton's approach. He did not speak to heal. He spoke to activate. And activation does not feel the same to everyone. In the crowd, there were veterans who had learned to armor themselves emotionally long before Patton arrived. There were replacements who had not yet learned how fear worked. There were men who would later be decorated for bravery, and men who would quietly disappear into statistics. Patton did not distinguish between them. To him, distinction weakened unity. His speeches erased individuality in favor of collective identity. You were not a frightened man. You were part of a force that did not stop. Your feelings were irrelevant. Your movement was everything. For some, this was liberation. For others, erasure. But in war, neither perspective mattered more than results. The army moved. Objectives fell. Momentum returned. And yet, in the private spaces where helmets came off and voices lowered, men processed the experience in isolation. No forum existed to reconcile pride with fear. No language bridged the gap between endurance and injury. The speeches had rebuilt purpose. They had also redrawn the boundaries of acceptable humanity. What that would mean in the long run was still invisible. For now, all that mattered was that the crowd dispersed, each man carrying the same words but bearing them very differently. The change was undeniable. Operations that had stalled now moved with urgency. Units advanced faster, pressed harder, accepted risks they had previously avoided. From a command perspective, the transformation looked like proof, evidence that morale had been restored through will alone. Fear had not vanished. It had been redirected. Soldiers no longer spoke of what might happen to them if they advanced. They spoke of what would happen if they did not. The axis of anxiety had shifted, from the enemy ahead to the judgment behind. This was exactly what Patton intended. Fear, when unchanneled, paralyzes. When given direction, it accelerates. By framing hesitation as moral failure rather than human limitation, he turned dread into propulsion. Men ran toward danger not because it felt safer but because stopping felt worse. On the battlefield, this produced results. Attacks were sharper. Orders were executed without delay. There was less debate, less hesitation, fewer moments where doubt could take hold. The army regained its momentum, and momentum in war is intoxicating. Success breeds belief. Belief fuels further success. From above it looked like renewal. But fuel burns. And fear burns hot. For many soldiers, the energy Patton unleashed came at a cost they could not immediately name. They pushed past pain, past exhaustion, past instinct. Limits were ignored. Warnings from the body were overridden by the louder command of expectation. This created extraordinary acts of courage. It also created quiet damage. Men learned to measure themselves only by forward motion. Rest became guilt. Caution became weakness. Survival itself felt conditional, earned only through constant proof of toughness. The army became faster. It also became brittle. Because fear-driven momentum does not allow pause. And without pause there is no recovery, only accumulation. Stress layered on stress. Silence layered on silence. Some soldiers felt proud of what they had become. Others felt hollow, as if something essential had been traded away for effectiveness. Both continued moving because movement was the only identity left to them. Commanders praised the turnaround. History would later mark these periods as decisive, aggressive, successful. But beneath the surface, fear continued to do what fear always does. Remembered. And when the war slowed, when the noise receded and the pressure lifted, those memories would surface, demanding acknowledgement long after the objectives had been achieved. For now, though, fear remained useful. It drove men forward. It rebuilt purpose. And it postponed the reckoning. Victories leave footprints on terrain. Costs leave them on people. As the campaign pressed on, the external signs of success multiplied. Captured ground, broken enemy formations, timelines pulled back from the brink. From headquarters the picture looked decisive. Morale, once fragile, now appeared hardened by purpose. But beneath the surface, a quieter transformation was unfolding. Fear, once turned into fuel, did not disappear when it was no longer needed. It lingered, stored away in places no after-action report could reach. In bodies that no longer relaxed. In minds that never fully stood down. Men who had advanced under relentless pressure learned to distrust rest. Silence felt wrong. Stillness felt dangerous. Without constant movement, thoughts returned, uninvited, unresolved. Some soldiers grew sharper, more aggressive, more detached. Others became withdrawn, conserving what little emotional energy remained. Both were adaptive responses. Neither was free. Medical officers noted patterns they struggled to explain. Men who had performed exceptionally well in combat now collapsed without warning. Tremors, insomnia, sudden rage, emotional numbness. The language of the time could not fully capture what was happening. These were not failures of courage. They were the echoes of sustained fear with nowhere to go. Patton rarely spoke of this cost. Not because he was unaware of suffering, but because acknowledging it threatened the foundation of his philosophy. To admit that fear could wound permanently was to admit limits he believed war could not afford. In his worldview, war was temporary. Victory would end it. Whatever damage existed could be dealt with later. But later is where fear often does its worst work. For some soldiers, the reckoning arrived during the war itself. They froze, broke down, were removed quietly, replaced without ceremony. Their stories ended not with medals but with silence. For others, the reckoning waited. It waited for peace. This was the paradox of Patton's success. By preventing collapse in the moment, he deferred it. The army did not break, but pieces of it fractured invisibly, each man carrying his own fault line. History would remember the speed of the advance, the brilliance of maneuver, the restoration of momentum. It would not easily remember the price paid in private. Fear had rebuilt purpose. But it had also rewritten the inner lives of those who carried it. And as the war pushed forward, the space for reflection narrowed. There was no time to ask whether another path had been possible. Only time to keep moving. Distance changes the sound of war. What once felt immediate, urgent orders, shouted commands, the thunder of movement, softens into something quieter, more reflective. This is where questions finally find space to exist. Not on the battlefield but after it. Not in commands but in memory. What kind of strength did Patton create? Was it courage or compliance? Resolve or suppression? Leadership or domination refined into purpose? Philosophers of war have wrestled with this long before the 20th century. Is a soldier strongest when he believes or when he obeys? Is morale built by inspiration or enforced by fear of collapse? Patton believed these were false distinctions. To him, belief without discipline was fragile. Inspiration without pressure was temporary. He saw obedience not as the opposite of strength, but as its expression under extreme conditions. In his mind, an army did not need comfort, it needed clarity. And clarity, even brutal clarity, could be merciful in chaos. Yet there is an unease that lingers. Because fear-driven purpose does not ask why, only whether you will. It creates motion but not meaning. It forges unity but often at the cost of individuality. It wins battles but leaves unanswered questions in its wake. Could morale have been rebuilt another way? Perhaps. Perhaps not. War rarely offers clean alternatives. Leaders choose between imperfect tools under impossible constraints. Patton chose fear because it worked fast, and because speed mattered more than comfort. But history does not only measure outcomes. It measures consequences. The question that remains is not whether Patton's speeches were effective. They were. The line moved. The collapse was avoided. The question is what kind of human endurance they demanded. Did they teach men to master fear, or to bury it? Did they build resilience, or merely delay breakdown? These are not questions with definitive answers. They are reflections that surface only when the guns fall silent, when victory no longer needs defending. And perhaps that is the final truth of Patton's leadership. It was not meant to be gentle. It was meant to be decisive. Whether decisiveness justifies the cost is something history continues to debate, not because the results are unclear but because the human price is. Long after the fighting moved on, the words remained. They echoed in memory, in post-war interviews, in histories written by those who tried to explain how momentum had been restored when it mattered most. Patton's speeches became legend, quoted, paraphrased, argued over. To some, they were proof of iron leadership. To others, a warning wrapped in success. What endured was not the exact phrasing. It was the tone. Unyielding. Demanding. Absolute. For veterans, the voice resurfaced in unexpected moments. In hesitation. In self-judgment. In the reflex to push harder when rest was needed. The standard Patton imposed did not dissolve with peace. It had been internalized. This was his true legacy. Not just victories on maps but a model of leadership that asked a brutal question. How much pressure can a human being withstand before breaking, and is it the leader's role to find out? Patton never apologized for his methods. He believed history favored those who acted decisively, not those who hesitated over moral ambiguity. To him, the survival of the mission outweighed the comfort of the individual. And yet, history is written by individuals. By the men who lived long enough to remember. By the families who noticed what never fully came home. by societies that inherited both victory and its cost. Patton's speeches rebuilt purpose through fear of collapse, but they also revealed something enduring about war itself. That when stakes are absolute, leaders are tempted to use absolute tools. That fear, when aimed correctly, can move mountains. And that the line between strength and damage is often visible only in hindsight. His voice became part of the mythology of command. A reminder that words, once spoken at the edge of collapse, do not simply motivate, they shape identities. And identities, once shaped under fire, rarely return to their original form. Eventually, even the most relentless wars grow quiet. Engines stop. Orders cease. Fields that once shook under bombardment return to stillness. The battlefield, stripped of urgency, becomes a place again, marked by absence more than action. This is where reflection begins. Looking back, it is tempting to simplify. To label Patton's speeches as either heroic or cruel, effective or excessive. But war resists simplicity. It demands decisions that feel wrong even when they work. Morale was rebuilt. Collapse was avoided. The army endured. And yet, endurance came with a weight. Perhaps that is the final lesson, not about Patton alone but about leadership under extreme pressure. That saving the moment can endanger the future. That fear can unify but never without residue. That purpose forged in crisis is powerful but rarely gentle. When morale cracked, Patton chose fear over comfort. It worked. History moved forward. But the echo of that choice remains, quiet, unresolved, waiting in the space where victory meets memory. Because when the noise finally fades, what endures is not the shout, but what it demanded of those who listened.